Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's expert roundtable to celebrate the 20th anniversary of the NEA Regulators Forum. People from around the world have registered to participate in this event. Now, to ensure a stable connection and considering the large number of attendees, your video and audio functions have been disabled. However, you can still actively participate in the discussion by expressing your views or sending us comments and asking questions using the Q&A function. Please note that we may not have enough time to take all of your questions. Now, if you experience any technical difficulties, please try the chat function. You can also listen in by telephone, and the international numbers are in the confirmation email message that you received. Today's discussion is being recorded and will be made available online in the near future. It is now my pleasure to give the floor to the Director-General of the NEA, Mr. William D. Magwood IV.
Thank you very much, and welcome. It's a great pleasure to have all of you join us for the celebration of the Regulators Forum. You know, as a former nuclear regulator, I can tell you that when people think about nuclear regulation, they almost exclusively think about the business of regulating the safety of nuclear reactors. And while that certainly is a very important part of what nuclear regulators do, probably even more work and even more people, when you add it all up, goes into looking at other aspects of the nuclear regulatory portfolio, and particularly dealing with the back end of the fuel cycle, dealing with issues such as the disposal of nuclear waste and dealing with decommissioning of nuclear facilities and legacy sites. These are very complex and very difficult assignments that regulators have to work with. And then often they find that the rules of the road that they create are even more difficult to establish than for nuclear reactor regulation. So because of that, and because disposal of radioactive waste has been an important part of the NEA portfolio for many years, there was clearly a desire to have regulators involved in the work of the back end of the fuel cycle. Under the auspices of the Radioactive Waste Management Committee, thinking had gone forward that it was time to bring regulators together to address these issues. That is how the Regulators Forum came to be 20 years ago. 20 years goes by very quickly, I'm afraid, because our Regulators Forum has been very active during that period, doing a wide range of activities with many accomplishments, which you'll hear about over the course of this webinar. And more recently, as we establish a new committee in the NEA, looking at the issues of decommissioning and legacy management sites, the Regulators Forum expanded its activities to incorporate those issues as well. So to go over what has been going on for the last 20 years, you're going to hear from people who were there, people who helped in the creation of the Regulators Forum and nurturing it to where it is today. I hope you find this review of the history and really the current issues of interest, and I'm looking forward to hearing from our very first speaker, who is Walter Bomod, who formerly with Belgium's Federal Agency for Nuclear Control and a chair of the Regulators Forum for a very long period, from 2015 up until just very recently. He led the adaptation of the Regulators Forum into its new position as overseeing both radioactive waste and legacy management and decommissioning. And not only that, but he initiated the revision of the Regulator Forum structure to make sure it had effective areas of management of work and working with all these different topics. So he has a very vast knowledge of the Regulators Forum and the work that it performs and the issues that it deals with. And so I invite him to take the floor to give a keynote speech to lead us off this afternoon. Walter, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Director General Magwood, for your introduction. And we are very honored to have you in this webinar dedicated to the 20th anniversary of the Regulators Forum. For the creation of the Regulators Forum, we have in fact to go back to '98. Regulators have been part of the Radioactive Waste Management Committee, the RWMC, since its creation. With time, a need was felt by the regulators to have a specific forum where regulators could exchange regulatory experience on issues related to the back-end fuel cycle activities and decommissioning, and this in a frank and informal setting and independently from the implementers. But it also served to enhance their visibility. So a group of regulators was formed as a subcommittee of the RWMC, the so-called RWMC SRL, or Subcommittee Regulation and Licensing. In 2000, the name was changed in RWMC RF, and its first mandate was approved in 2001. This is considered as the official start of the Regulators Forum. With the creation of CDLM, the Committee on Decommissioning and Legacy Management, as Mr. Magwood said in 2018, the name was abbreviated to Regulators Forum, RF as such. 20 years Regulators Forum, it needs some feedback in terms of what it stands for, what has been realized in this period of time, and what are the benefits of having such forum of regulators dealing with the back-end activities of nuclear. The Regulators Forum provides an environment in which all members have the opportunity to share their experience and best practices in order to refine the regulatory system in the field of radioactive waste management, decommissioning, and legacy management, but also including all associated activities such as transport activities. To support the ongoing project and initiatives, a holistic approach is being implemented hereby, taking into account economic, environmental, and societal factors in all stages of the radioactive waste management, decommissioning, and legacy management processes, and hereby adopting a phased approach to evaluate steps facilitating the development of regulation, the traceability of decision-making, and accommodating stakeholders' needs. Regulators Forum modus operandi consists of having a plenary meeting each year where proposals such as the program of work, mandate, and surveys prepared by the Regulators Forum Bureau, which is a selected group of RF members, where they are discussed for approval. The Regulators Forum organizes surveys, workshops, participates in conferences, organizes topical sessions with invited speakers, and cooperates with other NEA groups such as the Forum of Stakeholder Confidence, the Committee on Nuclear Regulatory Activities, and the Committee on Radiological Protection and Public Health, but also with organizations outside the NEA such as the IEA, WENRA, EC, etc. The Regulators Forum reported its activities each year to the RWMC, and since the creation of the CDLM, the Committee of Decommissioning and Legacy Management, also to this committee. This is, of course, all in agreement with the RF mandate, covering typically a period of 3 years, and that needs to be approved by both committees. With the creation of the CDLM, a revision of the RF structure and methods of work was initiated, such as the extension with regulators from the CDLM and the creation of RF ad hoc groups, and this in order to efficiently address requests from both committees. More information about the RF scope of work and achievements within 20 years service can be found in 2 RF decade brochures from 2009 and the other one from 2021. At regular meetings, there is an exchange of information on particular themes of regulators' interest, on recent developments, study findings, and surveys. Indeed, the Regulators Forum has successfully communicated with member countries through studies and surveys on regulatory issues in order to identify emerging challenges, needs, and areas of interest in safety regulation. Topical sessions are organized on various topics, such as in the field of geological disposal. For instance, long-term safety criteria, pre-licensing and licensing, reversibility and retrievability, but also on decommissioning, competency management for the regulator, clearance of radioactive materials, waste management after an accident, independence of the regulator, management of very low-level waste, optimization in waste management, graded approach, and environmental issues. At workshops, participants have the opportunity to exchange information about other member countries' national programs on radioactive waste management, decommissioning, and legacy management. Up to now, the Regulators Forum organized itself or participated in the organization of 8 workshops at the NEA, dealing with geological disposal with subjects like regulation of long-term safety, siting licensing operation challenges, and others dealing with competency management, decommissioning, and legacy management. The Regulators Forum has also a policy of producing documents for wide distribution. Typically, these address the development and refinement of the regulatory system with a view to improve regulation and regulatory practice, to illustrate the nature of the underlying issues, and to further establish the forum as an important source for regulatory guidance. Some examples of publications are The Evolving Role of the Regulator, which was published together with the Forum of Stakeholders Confidence, the publication on regulating long-term safety for geological disposal, reversibility of decisions and retrievability of radioactive waste, release of radioactive materials, just only to name a few of them. The Regulators Forum comparative study of the regulation of radioactive waste management in NEA member countries, which was already initiated in the beginning of the Regulators Forum, showed that there is no unique or best way to deliver the various elements of the regulatory cycle. The formal structures and organizational arrangements depend on the national constitutional structure, legal and institutional framework, and to a large extent on national regulatory culture. In most cases, important regulatory decisions only come about after coordination of a wide range of relevant and authoritative inputs. Over the years, and especially after the Chernobyl and Fukushima Daiichi accidents, the role of the safety regulators has been expanded, not only in rulemaking, but also in building open communication amongst regulators, implementers, and other stakeholders, and in promoting stakeholder involvement in the early stages of radioactive waste management, decommissioning, and legacy management projects. Now, what are the challenges for the regulators and for the Regulators Forum in the future? An important challenge for regulators consists in attracting young people and in gaining and maintaining competences. Challenges are identified in developing practical guidance for optimization and active implementation of strategies for the back end of the nuclear fuel cycle system, but also challenges linked to the changing nuclear landscape, such as phase out, associated with intensified decommissioning, new developments in robotics, small modular reactors, etc. Recently, regulators were also confronted with the situation of a worldwide pandemic. Of course, we were not the only ones. All these challenges drive a greater need for proper exchange of information and knowledge between regulators in different countries, ensuring as such proper integration of regulatory requirements. Regulators need to be proactive and vigilant to new processes and developments that may impact safety. They have to be involved early in processes in order to develop in a timely manner necessary competences, guidelines, and regulations addressing the application of new advanced technologies and methods. At the occasion of the 20th anniversary, we specifically want to thank all participating member countries and their delegated RF members, the chairs, and especially the management and secretariat people from the NEA for the tremendous support and work performed during these past 20 years. I specifically want to mention here some NEA division staff members who at that time, so more than 20 years ago, supported the RF creation and its launching, namely Hans Riot and Claudio Pescatori, as well as former Director-General Echevarri. We also want to thank involved NEA committees and groups for their always very constructive cooperation. Indeed, success is only possible with an open mind and a learning attitude from all of us. We are convinced that in the next years, as it was in the past 20 years, RF will be successful in tackling new regulatory, organizational, and safety-related challenges in radioactive waste management, decommissioning, and legacy management. Therefore, multinational cooperation among regulators, such as in the Regulators Forum, is essential. I want to finish my speech here, and I give the floor back to Director-General Magwood. Thank you very much.
Thank you for recognizing our colleagues, particularly Claudio, I think, who was so instrumental in forming the Regulators Forum 20 years ago. And working with Claudio, and perhaps Hans will talk about this, Hans Riot, who you also mentioned, who is going to be our next speaker. So let me ask Hans to join me on video as I introduce him. Hans started his career in the German government, where he worked at GRS and joined the Federal Ministry of Education and Research, where he was responsible for the German government's R&D program on deep geologic repository. But perhaps even more importantly, he joined the NEA in 1998, where he was head of division of radiological protection and radioactive waste management, where he oversaw these activities. He was the head of the division when the RF was created and was one of the main people who helped get this off the ground. So I invite him to share his memories about 20 years ago and maybe reflect on what the challenges were that were facing the Radioactive Waste Management Committee back in those days, and where the RF came into its activities, and how did you come to understand why a specific group of regulators was needed at the time. So with that, Hans, please take the floor.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Magwood, for this kind introduction and for the opportunity to share with the webinar participants now my more personal experience and my recollection of the factors that led to the creation of this regulators only group within the RWMC. When I joined the NEA in late '98, it was a time when various countries had been starting to consider procedures and rules for licensing of a future repository for high-level waste. And the committee had very much focused its work on geological disposal. I should note a specific feature of the RWMC was, and is still today, its mixed membership of representatives of implementers, regulatory bodies, policymakers, and supporting R&D institutions. And thus, the RWMC, of course, also started working to clarify some of the very important concepts used in the regulatory framework for long-term waste disposal, such as, for instance, the idea, the concept of stepwise decision-making. There were work and reports too on using multiple lines of reasoning, and of course, clarifying the idea and the concept of safety case for long-term projects and the role and limits of performance assessment as a safety indicator. Thus, the RWMC provided a neutral platform for a fruitful implementer-regulator dialogue on developing a licensing framework. The implementer appreciate the opportunity to discuss their approaches on how to demonstrate safety with the regulators, and this at a very early stage in the process. The regulators had an opportunity to monitor these efforts and to ensure that the basis was laid for regulations which are transparent to all and concerned and practicable. And the R&D institutions help to ensure that the proposed concepts were scientifically sound and reasonable. The regulation of the long-term safety of radioactive waste disposal was, of course, an issue not only of interest to the RWMC, but of course also to the safety regulator, CMRA, and the Committee on Radiation Protection, the CRPPH. And in January '97, and Walter mentioned this already, the three committees joined together and organized a workshop on this topic. At this Cordoba workshop, all three committees recognized the urgent need to further develop the regulatory framework for licensing repositories. And it became also clear that a reasonable international convergence of opinions between the national regulators must be achieved. Otherwise, it would not be possible to gain public acceptance on regulatory decisions. There were discussions in the beginning how this to be addressed, and if the regulation of long-term safety should become a NEA cross-cutting activity within the NEA program of work. And this idea was strongly rejected by the RWMC. And to drop some names, this time Søren Norby from Sweden, who was also chair at this time from the RWMC, and for instance, Margaret Federline from the NRC in the US. And the argument was that the RWMC first had clear responsibility in this area and also the competence. And that was a pull-out of the regulators of the RWMC. The committee would become a single partisan group, a lobbying group, and would lose its credibility. Thus, it was finally agreed to establish the regulators group within the sphere of the RWMC, and what's called then at the time the RWMC RG Regulators Group was launched in '98. The group's primary objective was to provide a mechanism of communication and information exchange and to enhance communication with other regulatory groups. And the participation in the group was restricted to the RWMC members belonging to regulatory bodies. To address concerns that the regulatory group should not formally report to a non-regulatory group, it was decided that the RWMC RG would generate its working topics and agenda autonomously. The RWMC would be informed of its internal discussions, but there was no hierarchical reporting to the RWMC. The RWMC group, regulators group, selected August Sörkinen from Switzerland for the first chair and started to produce a compilation of the information of member countries' policies and regulation related to red waste. And I just, in this context, would also like to acknowledge very much the work of Claudio Pescatore, already mentioned by Mr. Magwood. I think he was very instrumental in getting this on the track. Still, this issue of independence of the regulators group was still contentious, and its structural concept was easily misunderstood by outsiders. And therefore, when in the NEA in 2000 introduced a new common structure for all its standing technical committees with a clear hierarchy of working groups and working parties, this time was used to make a non-hierarchical relationship between the RWMC and its regulatory group more visible. The group names were changed from RWMC Regulators Group to Regulators Forum of the RWMC, and in organizational charts, the RWMC-RF was shown more separate from the RWMC, but on the same hierarchical level. And beyond the link to the RWMC, a dashed line pointing to the CNRA was shown, and a reference to the group, of course, was introduced in the new RWMC mandate. This transition was formalized when in 2001, the group's mandate was approved, and thus the RWMC Regulators Forum was born. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that review of the history. I was reflecting as you were going through that, the history that I remember when I first came on to the steering committee, when I was representing the United States back in those days. You were head of division, and I think I have vague recollection of you bringing this to steering committee, saying that we're moving in this direction. So it is dating us all, isn't it, Hans? To think this is 20 years ago.
Yeah, right.
Well, again, thank you very much for the reflection on the history. And I'll move on to the next speaker, which is Carl Magnus Larsen, who is with Australia today as the Chief Executive of the Australian Radioactive Protection and Nuclear Safety Agency. However, who back in the days, in past days, represented Sweden as a member of the RF, and today, and he chaired the RF between 2002 and 2006 as a representative from Sweden. And today he'll share with the audience his observation of the development of regulatory activities under the RF vision, and perhaps reflect on what's transpired over the last 20 years and way the regulators have looked at the back end of the fuel cycle. So please, Carl Magnus, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Director-General Magwood, and it's a pleasure to be able to address the auditorium and give you a few reflections on the activities of the Regulators Forum as I recall them and have participated in them. So as Director-General Magwood said, I was the chair of the Regulators Forum between 2002 and 2006, so that goes back quite a bit in time and to the early days of the establishment of the Regulators Forum and the establishment of its modus operandi, and a little bit about the status and its position in the committee structure of the NEA. And I would like to say that I think my memories from the early days are very much in agreement with the history that has just been told by both Walter Blommet and Hans Riotte. And I clearly recall in the early days, in the establishment phase, which actually predated the establishment of the RF, there was a little bit of hesitancy, there was a little bit of lack of understanding among members of the RWMC why there was a need for a specific group that discussed regulatory issues, and why couldn't they be discussed among the whole membership. And of course they could, but there was certainly the strongly felt desire by the regulators to establish a forum of its own and to discuss the specifics around the regulatory activities in relation to radioactive waste management. And eventually the structure, as Hans Riotte told us, was established. The Regulators Forum is essentially a cohort, a regulatory cohort, or was the regulatory cohort of the Radioactive Waste Management Committee. And it operates at the same level, and there was no hierarchy. It was not a formal reporting, or it was not a subsidiary to the RWMC. It was just the regulatory cohort, which was at the same level and interacting at the same level in the hierarchy with the Radioactive Waste Management Committee. And it has continued to develop in that direction, of course, with interaction that have been established also with the CDLM. And I think that is very good. And it has certainly promoted a definition and a development of the identity of the regulator and the way the regulators operate, and the way that the regulator operates, in particular with society. And the aspect that I just would like to focus on here, and because there is a limited time, and there will be other opportunities to discuss other aspects when we go a little bit further down in the agenda here, but that is really to the role of the Regulators Forum, which has been instrumental in promoting the proactive work of the regulator and the importance of the proactive work of the regulator. Going back 20 years in time or 25 years in time, it was a little bit more passive. It was a little bit more waiting for the industry to do its job. And once a license application were at the table of the regulator would deal with it. That has changed dramatically, and I think that has been acknowledged also in the publications that have been produced together with the FSC on the evolving role and the image of the regulator as it has developed over the last 20 years. So the Regulators Forum certainly has helped promote the proactive role of the regulator and defining the role as a partner that is able to inform the national policies and decisions already at the stage where those decisions are being taken, and not being affected, or sorry, not being necessarily just ruled by those decisions, but participating in those decisions. And this is a little bit following the philosophy of planning for the waste already before it arises, which is something that we all aspire to, but maybe not always are able to achieve. And from the radiological protection point of view, of course, radioactive waste management should be, especially when we talk about disposal facilities, it should be considered a planned exposure situation. One of the ideas with a planned exposure situation is that it should be so well planned that it cannot evolve into an accident or into an emergency exposure situation or into an existing exposure situation. But that doesn't mean that accidents can't happen. And it means that there can be, we have the major examples, of course, of Chernobyl and Fukushima, but there are also other accidents that have happened, and many of them have generated waste, and we have not been prepared for all of these accidents, of course, generate waste, and we have not been prepared for how to manage that waste when it arises. So planning for the waste before it arises, either it's a planned exposure situation or the waste arises through an emergency, that is fundamental. And to have the system in place before you have the waste, rather than backfitting solutions for the final management of the waste once you have gotten it. And I think that we're certainly not there yet, but I think with the work of the Regulators Forum, we are getting much more on the front foot in being part of the planning and in the setting of national policies and in taking the important decisions for society. The regulator is there already, and the regulator is asked the question. That is not necessarily always the case. It can be different in different countries. And sometimes a regulator is impacted by systems for cost recovery. Cost recovery is often based on the regulatory effort that is spent on the entities that are holding the license and carrying out the operations. That means that it's always looked at retrospective costs, whereas the problems are actually prospective. And in order to be able to deal with the prospective challenges, the regulator needs to be to have the adequate resourcing and have the research and policy capabilities that are necessary, and that is something that is up to governments and a responsibility for governments to make sure that actually is available to the regulator. So the cost recovery models are sometimes something that impacts on the ability of the regulator to take a very proactive stance in radioactive waste management. Another problem for the regulator, and that is a problem across the industry, but maybe in particular for the regulator, is the competence and skills to recruit and to retain the competence and skills, and to make essentially the regulatory work interesting enough in order to attract the young and ambitious people which have got bright new ideas. And I think it has been very interesting to follow also the work that has been initiated under the COMAREG initiative, really addressing the question about knowledge management broadly. So this is just one aspect of the work of the Regulators Forum. It has certainly helped the regulators to be much more proactive and be able to take action already at an early stage of any issue in the society that has to do with radioactive waste management. And there is a much more interactive role of the regulator that is present now, but importantly, of course, for the regulator, it's is always fundamental to stick to the fundamental values of a regulator, and that is the independence and the integrity of its processes, and continue to be at the forefront of rulemaking and fostering a culture for safety, and strive to, in the long term, be part of the system for stewardship of any waste management solutions. And I think I stopped there, and but that is a little bit of some of the a little bit of a review from my personal perspective of where I think that the RF has played an instrumental role. So thank you very much, and back to you, Mr. Magwood.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate the review of the evolution of these issues over the years. I think you made some very salient points. So I think this brings us up to date. We heard Walter provide a review of the big picture, and we heard Hans provide the history of the formation. Carl Magnus has now brought us up to date with the evolution, and now we're going to look forward a bit. And for that, we have Mario Dionisi, who is Technical Coordinator of Radioactive Waste Management and Nuclear Material Transportation for the Italian Inspector for Nuclear Safety and Radiation Protection. And he is a longstanding member of the RF since, I believe, 2002, if I'm not mistaken, and is currently serving as one of the two co-chairs of the RF. He will provide a vision looking forward now. And Mario, please, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Director General. Good morning, welcome to everybody. I'm, yes, you're right, I'm one of the oldest members of the Regulators Forum up to date. So very long experience in this group. I would like to say something about the past. Already has been mentioned the many activities the Regulators Forum achieved. Just as an introduction for the vision for the future of this forum. So before the creation of this new committee, the Regulators Forum since 20 years, behind its specific initiatives has been said topical session, workshop organized by Regulators Forum, internal discussion on several things, acted strongly in support for Radioactive Waste Management Committee and all the initiatives, bringing its contributes from the regulatory point of view. So different arguments raised by the committee that we know there are also mainly operators there. So we brought our contribute on regulatory point of views, identifying and analyzing emerging regulatory issues associated with waste management and decommissioning. I say also decommissioning because the RF worked in close cooperation with all the working parties and groups of radioactive waste management, among which the working party on decommissioning is mounted. So the Regulator Forum is not new on decommissioning issues, but also other groups like Forum of Stakeholder Confidence, but also with the other committees. Just to mention one or two has been already mentioned, the long-term safety criteria, and also the management, the regulatory issues in the management of non-nuclear radioactive waste management with the Radiation Protection Committee. Not to forget also the cooperation with other international organizations, the International Atomic Energy and Agency and the European Commission too. Just to mention among several arguments, this long-term safety criteria for disposal, clearance of solid material from regulatory control is really an issue since a long time, has been an issue since a long time for the harmonization of criteria of verification of this sector. The role of regulator in public confidence building, regulatory issues in decommissioning. We developed a workshop on that. So the creation of this new committee is change, of course, a bit the scope of the Regulators Forum. We as I said, already very involved in decommissioning through the WPDD, but not fully involved in legacy management, for instance. But that is an important thing because it offers the possibility now to consider regulatory aspect not only for decommissioning, but also for radioactive waste management in a more larger perspective. So the Regulators Forum showed that provided, and I'm sure will provide, continue to provide an environment where all the members can share regulatory experience and discuss emerging safety requirements in the specific area of radioactive waste management, decommissioning, and legacy management. Additionally, important thing to say that the Regulators Forum has been enlarged in composition. So the membership has been promoted in order to guarantee a balanced presence of experts in both the fields. While in the past, for instance, the composition was, I would say, on a random basis. So we were, at the beginning, we were experts from decommissioning or radioactive waste management. But now we are obliged to equilibrate and balance the composition of the forum in order to respond adequately to discussion in both committees. So, with the aim to respond to these both committees with a, let's say, different perspective, the Regulators Forum developed recently a strategic vision where an holistic approach, let's say, will be considered. It means from all aspects of economic, environmental, and societal factors will be taken into account. So to do that, the Regulators Forum created 2 ad hoc groups recently, last year. One for radioactive waste management issues, and the other one for decommissioning and legacy management. The objective of these 2 groups was to identify, through an analysis of the existing NEA documents and outcomes, very large details. However, the objective of the group has been to identify some shortcomings still to be investigated. So the objective was to identify a list of topics and area of regulation in radioactive waste management and decommissioning, and legacy management, where the Regulators Forum efforts would be beneficial for members of the both committees. And this list, together with a preliminary assessment of eventual gaps or challenges, with justifications and also reflections on the way forward and possible suggestions for future initiatives that will be considered for the future RF initiatives, and it will be taken into account in the program of work of the forum. So the group are still working, are finalizing their work, but already a list of priority topics has been identified. Interesting thing to say is that most of them shows many commonalities. Just to mention some of them, there is, for instance, multi-factor optimization or holistic optimization. This approach in regulatory requirements for either for radioactive waste management or for decommissioning and legacy management, that addressing challenges of sustainability and other factors like disposal of radioactive waste scenarios or consideration on costing and financial management. So this is a very large issue interested for both committees. Another specific for the decommissioning issue is the period between the shutdown of a nuclear installation, not only power plant, but nuclear installation, and the beginning of the decommissioning activities. It's in the recent year where larger nuclear installation is stopped and initiates the path through the decommissioning. We see that this transition period is a particular issue where regulatory, how to regulate this period could be explored more in detail. We see this necessity. Another specific argument, just to mention, is to create a more synergic and consistent process for the management of radiological and chemical hazard in decommissioning and legacy management. So early cooperation with all the different regulators is envisaged, and perhaps we can explore the conditions how to develop such process. Another argument important is a new technologies. We see that in radioactive waste management and also in decommissioning, legacy management, the use of innovative techniques or systems of technologies could be very important. So, but the regulator, as you know, always think about consolidated techniques. So how to arrange this, let's say, passage and give the possibility also to these new technologies to have the opportunity to improve the system. For instance, the use of robotic or remote systems, but also not forget these new type of reactors that we are hearing in these days, so it could be explored. So from this preliminary list, it's clear the future collaboration with the other committees or groups is not only envisaged, but recommended, strongly recommended. For instance, the one of transition period is one issue to be discussed also with the CNRA, the nuclear regulators, the committee. The other about robotic is necessary to coordinate with the expert group on robotic and remote system already existing in the Radioactive Waste Management Committee. So finally, I don't take other time. I would like to mention the brochure. It is a short document presenting the activity of the Regulators Forum, together with a flyer prepared for this 20th anniversary. Both will be published soon, where besides the list of results achieved by the Regulators Forum in these 20 years of activity, you can also find a description of the new vision of the Regulators Forum role. So I take again the floor to the Director General. Thank you for the attention.
Well, thank you very much for that overview. Excuse me. Let me thank all the speakers and all the panelists so far today. And let me ask you all to join me on camera. We're going to have a bit of a discussion here for the next few minutes. And what I'll do is I'll I'll pick up on something that that Mario mentioned in his comments, Walter, to ask you about this question about multi-factor optimization and what you see as the regulator's role in developing this and developing the back end of fuel cycle programs around the world. Perhaps you can comment on that.
Let's start to say that there is no universal solution for an optimal pre-disposal management, waste management applicable to all countries. And this due to country-specific technical and non-technical factors. As you mentioned, optimization is a complex multi-attribute process. And the question is hereby is also, what do we want to optimize? Do we want to optimize from financial point of view? Do we want to optimize from dose impact point of view, etc.? We need to define the attributes that will be taken into account and to balance them. Finally, different scenarios will have to be assessed considering technical and non-technical factors. But it should be clear that the optimal scenario solution will not necessarily be the best, we all know that, but rather the most acceptable given the prevailing or existing circumstances. Now the role of the regulator. Well, I consider the regulator, it should be considered as a companion or a partner in the development of a sustainable and safe waste development of sustainable and safe waste management solutions. This from cradle to grave, and he should apply thereby a holistic approach from economical, environmental, and societal point of view. These factors to be taken into account. Now, if he is a partner, partnership requires openness and respect for the role of each other in terms of responsibilities. However, as Carl Magnus already said, there is a need for the regulator to maintain its independency through the application of transparent processes and open communication. Now, the regulator depends, of course, on a stable, there should be a stable and consistent legal, regulatory, and organizational framework for licensing that should be in place to ensure that all required licenses can be granted in a timely fashion. There's also a need for sustainability and transparency in decision-making, and this is a major concern to both regulators and implementers. Once taken, decisions should not change frequently, especially due to non-technical or non-safety related factors, for instance, socio-political reasons. Implementers need stability for financing their project. We should be aware of that. The stepwise decision-making process could assist in gaining stability. What is important as well is that the regulator should conduct a self-assessment on a regular basis. You should also regularly conduct a comprehensive review of existing licensing principles and processes in order to put in perspective the possible challenges regarding the implementation of holistic optimization in waste management, decommissioning, and legacy management situations. The regulator was already said by Carl Magnus as well, I believe. The regulator should be vigilant towards new developments and develop competences with respect to advanced technologies, new types of reactors, and robotics. As already mentioned, also, an intensified dialogue with different stakeholders is needed based on a consistent terminology. And this is a very important point. We should talk about the same wording and the meaning of a word. Optimization does not necessarily mean the same for me as for other people. So let's first talk about the terminology and agree about what we will discuss about. So therefore, intensified cooperation among regulators from member countries, including involvement of other groups or organizations within and outside NEA, is necessary. And I believe the Regulators Forum is a good place for such exchanges. As Mario explained, at present, 2 RF ad hoc groups prepare a list of topics that could be taken into consideration in future work of RF, and this in order to better service, give a better service to RWMC and CDLM for what they are having as problems from regulatory point of view. That's what I wanted to say briefly about the role of the regulator and what he also needs to do his job. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think you captured the complexity of this issue very well. I'll note that the NEA is planning a large workshop. Will probably be sometime early next year on optimization, particularly in the context of communications with stakeholders, because the crux of optimization often involves a conversation, a dialogue with stakeholders to achieve the optimized outcome. And so that's a very complicated subject. And as you pointed out, to me, one of the most important issues to discuss will be, what do we mean by optimization? How do we define that term? And can we agree on a common definition to use as we go forward? And that I think is going to be a big challenge over the next few months. So looking forward to that to go forward. Let me ask all of you a very broad question. Perhaps Carl Magnus, you can take the first crack at this. When you look back at the work of the Regulators Forum, what has been the benefit of this effort over the years? Can you point to any instances in your experience as a national regulator where you found that the work of the Regulators Forum contributed to nuclear safety in your country?
Yeah, thank you. I think that you alluded to, Bill, in the beginning, that I have the privilege of having the experience from two countries, and obviously my background is from Sweden, a nuclear power country, and with an ambitious program for the management of the spent fuel and establishment of a disposal facility, deep geological disposal facility. The situation in Australia is different. It's not a nuclear power country, but has got a nuclear industry. And it's got, of course, as most countries will have, legacies since 100 years. I think that maybe what we could have done a little bit better among regulators is to take the experience from the nuclear power countries specifically about the length of the process, the level of engagement that is necessary, because there is no proportionality between the size of the inventory or the hazard or the type of waste that you have. There is no proportionality there. It occupies as much space in a country that has a relatively low inventory as it does in a nuclear power country in the public debate. So I think one of the lessons is that a contentious facility is a contentious facility, and in this particular case, it's not proportionate to the size. I think this is an experience that we have had in the nuclear power countries that we think is typical for the nuclear power countries, and it's not experienced by other countries. And we can probably, the countries that participate in RF with a background in a nuclear power program, draw the conclusions and make those conclusions available to many other countries around the world, where the problem from the inventory perspective is much, much, much smaller, but in the public space is just as big as it is in the nuclear power countries.
It's an interesting observation. I think you could even in some cases think that it's almost the opposite. It's not just not proportionate; it's actually disproportionate.
Inversely proportionate. Yeah.
Inversely proportionate. Yeah. And I think that's true in some cases. Mario, any thoughts about this question?
Thanks, Director General. So for sure, the experiences that the long experience it's been acquired in the numerous meetings, working groups, activities carried out in the Regulators Forum have contributed to develop better approaches in the decision-making processes in Italy, related to the licensing of radioactive management and mainly decommissioning activities in Italy. but also in the development of technical requirements and technical guidance in a more effective and I would say to the state of the art due to the sharing of experience with the other colleagues, international colleagues. I'm thinking in particular of the activity of verification and control of the release of solid material from the decommissioning of nuclear power plants, for instance, I mentioned before, or technical guides. We recently developed a safety criteria for the storage of radioactive waste published 2 years ago. One for decommissioning, it's going to be published the final version, and the disposal that guidance for disposal that is currently in public consultation. Again, in this area, for example, the communication involvement of the public has certainly gained from the information obtained from participation in the activities. Within the cooperation the REF had with the Forum of Stakeholder Confidence. In particular, in this period in Italy, there is the national seminar, it's a public consultation in the siting process, so it's really all the information that we get from the Forum of Stakeholder Confidence is now applied, implemented in the reality. So that's all for the moment.
Very interesting. So both of you have highlighted this sort of a communication aspect of this that's very important. Hans, comments?
Yeah, thank you. I think beyond these technical issues and the dialogue with public, we should not underestimate this very basic functioning of the NEA groups in just the exchange of information, reviewing the information, and compiling the information, make it available. And so I feel these consensus views, consensus papers, also on very general issues, not technical ones, are very important. And if they produce short papers, which can be done, this can be an important support in opinion forming within national agencies, not only between them. And I think it's also underestimated the importance of using these common views in the dialogue with the policymakers within the national sphere, particularly if there are a couple of entities and institutions are involved in nuclear decision making. I think this plays an important role and is used. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think it's an important aspect of this. I think sometimes we overlook that, and because it's sort of the bread and butter of international organizations, that kind of exchange. So thank you for highlighting that. Walter, I'll give you a chance at this as well.
Thank you, Director General. Well, the benefits are perhaps not always directly visible in national programs or activities, but the fact that the Regulators Forum, for instance, stimulates an open and frank communication amongst regulators is very important and very helpful in developments in the country. Experience feedback from others is extremely helpful as well in developing new regulations and guides. As we do in Belgium, we are preparing regulation and guidelines for the development of nuclear disposal installation and nuclear disposal facilities. And the activities of the Regulators Forum and the interaction with other regulators, especially with advanced programs, are very helpful and will be very important in decision-making on siting and licensing, for instance. Another point that we appreciated is the discussions about retrievability and reversibility, and especially about the significance that should be given to those terms. A point that will also be very helpful, but we did not discuss that much, for instance, is the discussion or argumenting national proposals or final destinations of what I say or would say problematic wastes. A lot of countries have bituminous waste, for instance. What to do with it? Radium waste, large volume waste. We had already discussions about the large volume waste, and we know it is a problem. because the two accidents, Chernobyl and Fukushima, clearly demonstrated the non-readiness from regulators' point of view for such accidents, and what to do with the waste afterwards. So this is what I would like to add. Thank you.
Interesting point, and you highlighted those instances where perhaps the regulators weren't quite ready for what happened, and it's always difficult to look into the future and know what's going to happen and prepare for it. However, let's talk about the future, and I'll give each of you just a very brief opportunity to think about this. What do you see as the challenges of the future? What are going to be the factors that are going to change how regulators approach these issues? Maybe this time I'll start with Mario on that question.
Thanks, Director General. So what's the vision for the future? I already mentioned some of the issue that the Regulators Forum has on the table for discussing the next program of work. But what to say in general, I think the central role of regulators is achieve the ultimate objective of ensure the safety of the public and protecting the environment. So I think one word, flexibility, I think will be the most important characteristic that the regulators should take into consideration for the future. We talked about multi-factors and so on. So decision will be achieved on the basis of assessment coming from various domains and disciplines. So regulators will have to be able to understand the multiple factors involved in the decision-making process. I would like to add communication, as already I mentioned, because there is still to do, because communication with public, not only with the implementers, will continue to be important for developing solutions. For instance, geological repositories. So we have a good example from some countries, but different situation in other countries. So the communication is also a key word. That's all for me. Thanks.
Thank you, and I'm sure that people are thinking, we're listening to this, that if there's any attribute that one immediately associates with regulators is flexibility, right? That's Carl Magnus, what do you think? What are going to be the things that influence the future?
So I absolutely agree with what Mario was saying, of course, with the communication aspects and all of that. But I think going a little bit further in the future, and we will see more and more of these facilities being established. And, you know, we have always been talking about the period of institutional control and what comes after and so on. And it's mainly been talking about because we haven't got as many facilities, but many facilities are being planned and many are being constructed. And maybe we should talk about in the future, change a little bit the approach and talk about, maybe use the term stewardship and the role of the regulator in the stewardship, in the long-term management. And coming back to what I said initially, there are some core values that the regulator need to maintain, which is obviously the independence and also integrity of the processes. But I think there is also going to be a very different role of the regulator when we go into the long-term management and the stewardship and the sharing with local populations and other stakeholders. I don't think that we fully understand what that stewardship mechanism is going to be in the future. But I think it's time now to start to discuss it, because we are going to enter into that discussion either we want it or not. So better be prepared for it.
It's a very interesting point. Let me, Walter, I don't, was this something that during your tenure, this issue of stewardship had come up? Is this a conversation you've been having? And also please provide any thoughts you have about the future as well.
Well, we had some discussions a given moment about the stewardship and the institutional control, and this is what was at the origin of the creation of the tripartite. At that time, we had a workshop about it with the law committee, about what does it mean in the long term, who will be responsible, and so on. And it's still going on. It's not finished, so that's for sure. Now, what I see important challenges for the regulator as such, and of course it will be reflected then afterwards in the forum, is the assessment of safety cases and ultimately the licensing of final disposal solutions for radioactive waste, whether it's a national, regional, or international solution, and related to that, the communication around it, mainly with other stakeholders and especially with the public, acceptability of it. Another point is the phase out from nuclear and associated challenges, intensified decommissioning, extended storage of waste. In the absence of a disposal solution, the waste is still there, and with decommissioning, more waste will be generated. But the longer well, the absence of a disposal facility means that the waste is getting older as well. And you come in a circle that you have to retreat the waste and retreat and retreat, and the volume is going up. And also the fuel is not forever. It's not stable forever. Don't believe it. And then that's one thing. And then the financing as well. That might be a problem in the far future, because if some agencies are funded by the electricity companies. Well, not directly, of course, but the financing are coming from there. If nuclear stops, then the waste is still there. You need a regulator. You need the money for it, and it might become a problem in the long end. Another thing is the new technologies that are coming up. So the regulator will have to develop its competences. Another point, so is the knowledge management and competence development is a point. And especially, I mentioned in the beginning, is the motivation of young people or young professionals to step into the nuclear. If we phase out, it's difficult to convince younger people that there is still a future in nuclear in your country. There is for sure a very long future, because the waste is still there for a very long time. But it's hard to convince people. Thank you.
Thank you. I think you raise a very important point. Now, certainly as we monitor what countries are doing around the world, I think a large number of countries are either building or planning to build nuclear facilities, but there are a few that are planning to phase out their nuclear programs, and I think that will create special challenges that we're going to have to prepare for. And in particular, I really appreciate the point that you raised about the stability of spent fuel very long term. And the longer we keep these materials in storage, the less clarity we have about what's actually in the can that's been sitting there for 50, 75, how many years before disposal. And that's going to be a very interesting issue, and maybe one that we should be preparing for now, because if we wait until 75 years ago to ask the question about what's in that canister, that's a much more expensive and difficult challenge than what we would face if we deal with it now. And I'm going to switch gears a little, because we're going to run out of time. So I go to Hans, because Walter pointed out this issue of young people and bringing young people into these issues. And so how do regulatory bodies deal with this? But whether in the phase out or not type of situation, what should we be doing as a community and as regulators to make sure that we can go forward into the future with the right expertise that we need under difficult circumstances. I wonder if you have some thoughts about that.
Well, I can say some. Sorry.
I'm sorry. I was actually directing it to Hans. I'm sorry. If I wasn't clear.
sorry. Sorry. I'm on. Yeah. So, well, I think this was mentioned by Walter before. That this issue of attracting young professional scientists to the profession is, of course, not just restricted to the regulator, but I think the challenge there is the same for many in the technical areas at least. It's a changing attitude towards work. Young people, they don't want anymore and don't expect a professional career the old way. This has changed. They want flexible careers. They want a professional future which is not seen as a one-way street. And I think they don't have the right perception of the work as a regulator. So I think it's important to open up the world of really working as a regulator and find the contacts to young people. So young people and young professors must give a kind of possibility to make this experience to meet senior regulators in the society. And I think there must be ensured that there is flexibility, that the flexibility first in the kind of very different disciplines which are under the roof of a regulated activity. And all to show this, I think an instrument which can be used there is summer schools or similar event, maybe not as a regular event, but something. So beyond their function as a training instrument, I think they provide also the opportunity for young professionals to really understand what the work looks like and to understand the broad spectrum of activities. And they help them to provide direct contacts with senior professionals. Another area I think which must be taken into account is continuous training, lifelong learning. And it's also something which is attractive for young professional joiners. There's one other issue, I think, well, once a regulator and always a regulator, there's an attitude which might be helpful to creating a specific mindset, which is helpful to do the work as a regulator, but it's not an option for all young people. And regulators tend to be, in most countries at least, public servants. And changing career in public service towards, let's say, an industrial environment or vice versa is difficult and may impose various disadvantages on social benefits, retirement benefits, and so on. And if we look for attracting people, it's not only young people, I think. We should also look at attracting people which coming from other industry professions that are already have a professional standing, and are not more addressed as young people. So I think for them, there are many hurdles to join the different administrative systems. And there may be a task for the NEA to just collect experience of various member countries in providing some help to people who want to change, come in or go out in the regulatory sphere as a civil servant. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I think you touched on some really important things there, because part of, I think, of the attractiveness of the regulatory work isn't simply the technical work, which you can do in many different areas, but it's also sort of the ethos of being a regulator, you know, the mission and the purpose of being a regulator. I think that's a public service, a benefit to society that I think can be attractive to young people if it's presented in the appropriate way. So I appreciate you highlighting that aspect of it. Mauro, you're in a country that no longer operates nuclear power plants, so I imagine, you know, what the future that Walter's worried about, you're now living. So how do you attract young people to be a regulator in a country where it doesn't have a nuclear program, or no longer has a nuclear program?
Thanks, Director General. Good question. We are paying the fact that we came out from the nuclear energy since many years. So we know the problem. About the solution, possible solution, I could say, I come back to the keyword of communication. I think, first of all, we have to be able to communicate that the regulator is not a boring bureaucrat. It's, first of all, it's a scientist who understands the technical problems and in a certain way guides other than supervise the operator to implement safe solutions. So for population and the environment. So it's a very important job for society. I think we miss this step. According to what NEA could do in this issue, I agree with Hans. It's called summer school. I think specific training sessions for young graduates in nuclear disciplines, it could be attractive. I think the prospect of being able to take advantage of international courses on safety is very attractive for young people. Of course, more experienced members like us can contribute as trainers, of course. That's all for the moment. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you very much. And Carl Magnus, you have not had to phase out that you haven't built yet, but the conversation seems like it spins around a lot in Australia over the course of time.
Well,
what's your view?
Yeah, so I think it's a question of being, of course, an attractive workplace, and the flexibility that people have been talking about here, and the ability to confront yourself and engage with a lot of different competencies. And for an organization like Arpensa, for instance, we are a regulator, yes, but we're also our own technical support organization, if you like. So there is always the opportunity to go around in the organization and be more involved in the science work, in the emergency response work, and also in some of the administrative and planning work. So, you know, that I think is something that we probably have underutilized, but we really have the ability to do it. So it's a question of formulating a program that actually makes that happen. And another way of doing it is, of course, to time-limited outposting to other agencies, where I think that one just needs to be a little bit cautious, because sometimes when you do that, they will never come back. But if you do it for solving a particular problem, and you form that group that solves that problem, and you outpost someone to another organization, they will solve that problem. They will come back and they will implement it, and that's going to make it a lot more interesting. And I think that in our particular trade, there is always the international work that is, you know, a big attraction for a lot of people. Gives an opportunity to get around in the world, meet international colleagues, see facilities in other countries, and it's not something that all regulators have in the way that we have it. And the international work, the NEA, IAEA, and even into the health sector, World Health Organization, and of course we have got organizations like ICRP and so forth. That is a huge attraction and something that keeps people alert and interested.
Very good points. Thank you for raising that. Walter, you started this conversation. Maybe you have a final thought before we close this subject out.
Well, of course, as a regulator, it depends how urgent you need something. And in the changing nuclear landscape at this time, some things are going quite fast. because the phase out in Belgium, for instance, it will be in a few years, and then it will be intensified decommissioning as well. And then you need, as a regulator, because also the people are leaving from the regulator, that's for sure, because they are better paid somewhere else or something. If you're really looking for an expertise, then you are going to look for older guys. Well, not really old guys, but not very young people anymore, because they don't have the practical experience, what you really need at that moment. That's one thing. So you need the money for that, and that's another issue. Probably because the payments of the regulator are mostly less than in industry. That's one problem. For the young professionals or the young people, well, there are a few things. We should involve them more and more in ongoing activities, meetings, workshops, conferences, and give them a special place in these conferences. Let them discuss a little bit about the subject that is discussed in the meeting. I believe that the Forum of Stakeholder Confidence has some experience in that at that point, and very positive experience, I think. The NEA is also the NEST initiative for young professionals, training for young professionals. CRPPH is started already the summer schools for radiation protection. These are means of attracting or at least informing young people what is going on in the world. Another point is the dissemination of results of work performed by the Regulators Forum, for instance, via open communication channels. The only problem, and that's always a problem, that is how do we reach them, these young guys that might be interested? Where do we find them? Do we have to go to the university or what? And that's a major problem, I believe. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you for those comments. I think I'll add to all of you that one of the things that I think will help as you communicate to young people is to have to show that we're a much more diverse and inclusive group than we have been in the past. And while the current panel may not look particularly diverse in terms of gender or other things, that's not where we are today. You know, the current head of division of the NEA is female. You mentioned the Forum of Stakeholder Confidence many times, who is chaired by a female. So while we normally try to have more of a gender balance on these things, because we're looking in the past, we didn't have that opportunity, I'm afraid. But the future, I think, will be one where we are shown to be much more inclusive, and that's going to be part of marketing what we do to young people to highlight things like that. So we are pretty close to out of time, but I did think we had a promise to Mario to give some very quick final thoughts, because he is the RF co-chair, and maybe he can just end with a few quick thoughts, if you please, Mario.
Yeah, thanks, Director General. Just a few considerations. I see we are behind the time schedule. So I think we have heard today that we can certainly recognize to the Regulators Forum to have played and to play a very important role in the evolution of the role of regulators in the field of nuclear safety, but also in the greater collaboration between regulators and implementers. This was possible, however, and this must be recognized, not only thanks to the expertise and active participation of the members of the RF, but mainly thanks to the support of the NEA Secretariat, I would say, always present and very professional. It is also to be recognized that the framework of NEA is very, very peculiar. The peculiarity of NEA with respect to the other international organization. Because it represents only, I think, I would say, international environment where regulators and all types of operators, NPP operators, agencies, for waste management, decommissioning industries or operator, and other nuclear fuel cycle industries. Where sit together and really put on the table the real problems. So it's important to say that today we are here not only to celebrate the past, but mainly to present our vision, our commitment to face the future challenges in the field of safety of radioactive waste management, decommissioning, and legacy management. The constant and continuous dialogue between regulators and implementers has allowed and will allow to guarantee the maximum safety in the management of radioactive waste and in decommission, with an approach that goes behind the written rules, but take into account all the important factors for the sustainable development. With these words, I give back the floor to you, Director-General. Thank you for all the panelists to be here today. Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much. And so we'll go ahead and wrap up. And let me thank you, Mario, for your continued leadership on the RF and the contributions that you're making, particularly as we expand into beyond waste into decommissioning legacy management. So I appreciate it very much. Carl, Magnus, and Walter, for your leadership over the course of a long stretch of time. My thanks to both of you, and the very good comments all of you made today. Let me say that. Appreciate the conversation. But again, for the two past chairs, thank you for what you contributed to make the RF what it is today. And I will conclude by thanking Hans for the leadership that he displayed 20 years ago alongside Claudio Pescatore and Luisa Travia to make this all come to reality. Your legacy is in place and firmly moving forward into the future. And I certainly look forward to inviting you back for the 50th anniversary of the RF when we get around celebrating that. So with that, I will hand it back to our disembodied voices to close out today's webinar. Thank you again for joining us, and thank you for all your comments.
Thank you very much to all our speakers and to all of you who listened in. We appreciate your participation. Today's event has been recorded and will be available on the NEA website soon. You can also follow the NEA on Twitter and LinkedIn to keep in touch with us and receive updates on our programs and events like this one.